and welcome to what is, for many of us, the best video of the year. It's one of my favourites to film, it's one of my favourites to watch, and it's one of my favourites just to like engage with and follow even throughout the year. It is, of course, as you can tell from the title and also kind of the upload date, the best books of 2020, or in this case, my favourite books of 2020. So to get the kind of semantics out of the way, these are not all necessarily books that came out in 2020, they are just books I read in 2020 and really stand out as sort of something special that I would recommend to so many of you for one reason or another, and want to give an extra shout out here at the end of the year. So I actually read 113 books in whatever year just happened, 2020, literally just said that, and it was tricky narrowing it down because I read a lot of 4-star books in particular. And what I find is interesting when I do put together my list of best books of the year is that it's not necessarily all the books I gave 5 stars, because sometimes you rate a book based on your initial feeling at the end of it, and then you forget about it, whereas other books you don't feel like are perfect. They maybe get a 4-star because at the time you thought, I wonder if that could have been different, but then they stay with you. And that's the case with some of these books. So we have books I either give 4 or 5 stars, both excellent ratings, means I love a book, like I really enjoyed a book if I gave it 4 stars, and have continued to stay with me. I've thought about, I've recommended in other videos potentially, and just feel like, again, stand above the rest. And that's not to say the other books I gave 4 or 5 stars this year weren't amazing, but you know, you have to narrow it down somehow. So these are the ones I came to, and there are 12 of them. We have non-fiction, fiction, adult books, children books, classics, modern literature, literary fiction, science fiction, and a little bit in between, a little bit of everything, I like to think. I also feel like these 2020 wrap-ups are quite good indicators of my reading taste, which is quite eclectic. So yeah, without further ado, let my rambling cease and we will get on with the best books, in my opinion, of 2020. So these books are in no way ranked, there's no best of the best in my eyes, and for that reason I'm just going to be going through them as I see them. I have them here on my laptop, and I'm going to start with the 4 non-fiction books, because I always find that at the end of the year some of the best books I've read, proportionally more of my best books than actually what I've read, is non-fiction, and that's because often good non-fiction really has the biggest impact on you and it really stays with you the longest. And I read some great non-fiction this year, but I wanted to mention these 4 in particular. So the first one is actually quite fun because it's a book I read for a reading vlog right at the beginning of the year, which was reading the best books of 2019 according to other booktubers, where I read other booktubers' favourite books of the previous year, and one of those was The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which then ended up being a 5-star favourite read for me, and I think that's a really fun way to start off this video. So this is a non-fiction book, as I've already indicated. It's non-fiction history, I would say. This best fits into the sort of history genre, although it encompasses a lot of aspects of history, specifically of sort of working class women in Victorian London. But the central premise of the book is that it is looking back at the lives of Jack the Ripper's victims. So not their deaths, not their murders, not conspiracies around the serial killer that murdered them, but their lives. And of course it carries on up until the day they died, but it doesn't focus on that moment. We get far more background on what their lives would have been like based on circumstances and what we know their lives were like, say divorces and marriages and children and jobs based on records. Hallie Rubenhold's done so much research for this book and turned up so much information on these women than I ever assumed we had. I don't know much about the Jack the Ripper story in general, and this is not the Jack the Ripper story, it's the story of these women. But I didn't have much background, I didn't know much about the victims, and I was surprised by how much the author could uncover through the sources, both, like I said, through actual like registrations of things like births and deaths and eyewitness accounts that were recorded by the police, as well as just sort of based on what would have been common for women at that time in Victorian London. And from that perspective I feel like it's also more of a general history of working class women's lives in London in the Victorian era, but just through focusing in on a small selection of women who are tied together by this serial killer, but were humans and women and people in their own right and deserve to have their stories told. And I thought it was so phenomenal, like such a great premise, really turns our obsession with serial killers on its head and sort of introduces you to a historical period and a historical topic through a vehicle that may sort of bring more people to the table, and I really enjoyed that. And I also just thought it was very accessible. Victorian London is not my area of expertise by any means, but I really felt like I could follow what was going on. I felt like I learned tons and could jump straight in at the deep end, but it didn't feel in any way surface level as a history book. So just masterfully done, absolutely adored it, and I think it's wonderful to see more books like this coming out in the sort of history, popular, accessible history field. The next book is actually a collection of various different testimonies. I wouldn't necessarily call it an essay collection, because what is particular about this book is that it is an oral collection. So all of the essays or chapters in this book were collected orally by those that experienced them and written down by the organisation that put this book together. It is, of course, if you've seen some of my previous videos, Inside This Place Not Of It, which is all about women's experiences of the prison system in the United States. So we have women from various different backgrounds. We have trans women, we have cis women, we have women from various different ethnic backgrounds, and how their experiences differ but are also strikingly similar in the sort of injustices and abuses that they faced in prison. And it is heart-wrenching but so important. I have read a few books on prisons in the past few years, and I found far more focus on the male incarceration system, men's prisons, so it was really nice to get first-hand perspectives from women of their experiences, because there are a lot of issues, not necessarily unique, but more prevalent to the women's prison system, and also trends in what leads women to be incarcerated. One of the most horrifying stories I remember from this book is that one woman had a non-consensual, a forced hysterectomy that she did not agree to prior to the surgery. She thought she was going in for something else, and they just gave her a hysterectomy while they were there, which is just appalling. And I think it's really important to hear these individuals' voices, because they have experienced something that you never think you're going to experience until you are in it, and they can really highlight all of the atrocities that are in place and commonplace within the incarceration system in the US, but are not unique to the US. And I thought it was just phenomenally done. I love the way this book is approached as a non-fiction project, that is these oral stories collected from the individuals and put together by this organisation. It's published by Verso, who are one of my favourite non-fiction publishers of all time. They always bring out like stellar stuff, and this is such a good example of that. Again, I feel accessible in tone because of all the sort of just voices of regular women that it includes, and if I haven't already iterated, so very important, so would highly recommend that one. On that subject, I do want to mention another book that deals with the incarceration system in the US, and that is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So this is a book I've been meaning to read for quite a few years, and I finally got around to it, and I'm so pleased I did, because in parts, yes, it covered aspects of the US incarceration system, racism within the incarceration system, and just generally institutionalised racism in the US that I was familiar with from other books like Angela Davis's work or books like Inside This Place Not Of It, but I also learned some really disturbing information that I didn't know beforehand, and got a much broader picture that sort of put all this together in my mind, because this book doesn't exclusively deal with prisons. It also deals with kind of police racial profiling amongst the police. It deals with the way in which laws have literally been built up in the US to target different ethnic groups in different ways, and how disturbing that is, and looks at the sort of justice system as a whole in that respect. And the premise of the book is in the title, which is that in a way, in the way it functions in society, the mass incarceration sort of platform on which the US sort of government runs is akin to a new form of the Jim Crow laws of the Jim Crow era. Through the incarceration system, a segregated society is enforced, and it's so disturbing but so eye-opening and so important. Again, I know I don't live in the US. For one, I find it much easier to find books about prisons in the US than anywhere else, and that's probably because there are so many prisons and so much incarceration happens in the US, and the population is just so big, but also because I still think it's really important to understand the struggles that are going on in countries outside of your own, but also to sort of, you can learn about your own country through looking at others and sort of examining the similarities, and it gives you ideas of what to look into. Then lastly, I have a memoir, Unicorn by Amru Al-Kadi, which is subtitled The Memoir of a Muslim Drag Queen. Now, like I said, this is a memoir, like the subtitle tells you this is a memoir. We've covered that basis, Jean. And it's all about the author's journey and experiences as a young Muslim from quite a conservative background who moves to Britain as a child and gradually comes to terms with their own sexuality and gender identity, even while those around them cannot necessarily do the same. Then in turn, all of the sort of quite oppressive and abusive experiences that they face growing up whilst coming to terms with those very, very important aspects of their identity. I actually found myself tearing up at this book, particularly during Amru's childhood, because it's just so hard to read about the sort of pressures and the sort of bullying from both people you know and are friends with and love and our families as well as strangers, that young people just trying to understand their own sexuality and gender identity can face, and Amru faced, and the intersections between both his like cultural heritage and his conservative family background and how they reacted to those sides of his personality, but then also the racism. And it deals with both the rejection that they dealt with from their more conservative family and sort of finding a way to mesh their faith and what they had been taught was right or wrong when they were growing up and who they were, as well as the racism that they dealt with, sometimes from those who supposedly were meant to accept them for the other aspects of their identity but couldn't seem to accept their race or faith. And I just found it so like heart-wrenching but important to read this personal journey and how they sort of came into themselves in person and how they have found within themselves the self-love and the love that they didn't always get from everybody else. Important as the story is, the way it is written down and delivered does matter as a reader, and it was delivered extra well. So yes, absolutely brilliant. And that brings me to the end of my 4 non-fiction books, which in turn brings me to my 8 fiction books. So I know I said I didn't have like a favourite and these books weren't ranked, but I have to say, if you asked me what the best book I read in 2020 was, I keep coming back to this as like one of my sort of 3 answers that I give, and that is A Long Way to Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I know, I am jumping on a bandwagon here because everybody and their grandmother has already fallen in love with this book. It came out a few years ago and I remember the hype around it. I remember how adored it was, both by like hardcore sci-fi and fantasy readers, but also by readers who didn't typically read within that genre. And I'd always in the back of my mind thought, yeah, I'll get to it. But then my friend Tasman gifted it to me this year when we did a book haul swap on my channel. So that was the clincher. I had my copy, Tasman had raved about it. I felt, yeah, okay, I've got to give this a try. And I am so pleased I did. Thank you, Tasman, for finally pushing me over the edge because I adored this book. This book is so much of what I love in SFF. So one of the most important things to me as a reader is character. I love characters that I can not necessarily like love every aspect of or want to be, but can just really get invested in and enjoy following the story of and imagine as fully fleshed people, not necessarily human being because there is aliens in this one. And I just felt that so strongly with this book. This book is a character driven story. It is not a book with a clear sort of peak plot moment that then sort of tapers down right at the end. It is a book with a sort of like solid line of character development with small blips of action. Like I feel like this is how I would describe it. It's like do 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 all the way through. It never really feels like there's one moment which is the moment we've been building up to. And I really enjoyed that. I don't find a lot of SFF or fiction in general that does that, and I really, really like that. Like, I don't necessarily need the most important bit of the story to come at the end. I am quite content sort of experiencing that journey with the characters. It reminds me more of a television series in that respect, and I'm a big series watcher more than a film watcher because I like that sort of small peaks with every episode, and that's what this feels like. It feels episodic but within one novel. It's set in a far-flung future. in which we are interacting with all of the other planets full of aliens and travelling the universe in our spaceships. And we follow a ship crew, including humans and a array of various other alien species, and their adventures together and the relationships they build up with one another, the good, the bad, and everything in between. And I just adored it. I loved these characters. Like, the characters meant everything to me, and also just the intricate way that Becky Chambers builds this world. Like, it was incredibly detailed. I don't know anything about science, but her lingo was very convincing to me. It felt so detailed as a science fiction future universe, and it was so impressive because it made it feel so tangible, it made it feel so real, and it really set the perfect backdrop for these characters. Just absolutely perfect. Would reread and will be reading the rest of the books in the series, so yes. So now that we've gotten that one out of the way, I actually want to talk about a children's book, which I think a lot of people would guess as my favourite book of the year, and it's definitely up there. It's in this video, and maybe it is the second best fiction book I read this year, but it's its own unique reading experience, and I feel like it's the series as a whole that's really burrowed its way into my heart. Of course, it is The Mysterious Howling by Mary Rose Wood, which is book 1 in The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place. So this is a middle grade series with 6 books, and I read 5 of those books this year. I never read 5 books in one series in a whole year. Never, never, never. Rarely do I read 2 books from one series in a whole year. So this must have been good for me to feel that commitment to the storyline and follow through. I only finished book 5 like a month ago as well, so I will certainly be reading book 6 in the very, very near future, in the coming weeks probably, because I need that satisfaction, but at the same time I'm also like sad and scared for it to be over. But you know what it's like reading the last book in a series. It is, like I mentioned, middle grade, and it's set in the 1800s in Britain, and it's about a young governess who is off on her first proper job after school. She went to a boarding school for young girls that trained them up to be governesses, and she's been sent off to her first household where she is going to be the governess to 3 young wards, and they are not the biological children of the Lord and Lady in this manor. They were found in the wood, and the Lord decided to adopt them because he thought it was funny. He thought, hey, I found some feral children in my woods, I'm gonna keep them. And he does, and he needs a governess. So enter Penelope. She's just like the absolutely best character, and it's such a funny series. It's so witty. I know it's for children, but it's certainly a series that adults could enjoy. There's so much like whimsy and joy and humour in there, but also like genuine mystery and fun adventure-fueled plot, and just like really clever writing. Mary Rose Wood is a very clever writer, and I really enjoyed her sense of like pithy humour throughout these books. So yes, Mysterious Howling, first book in an incredible series that I would highly recommend to all ages. Just to carry on with the completely different to the last book I mentioned theme we have going, I wanted to mention The Majesties by Tiffany Tsao. This is a literary novel with an element of like mystery thriller. I wouldn't necessarily call this a thriller at all, but it's certainly a mystery. It's predominantly set in Indonesia, and it's about a young woman named Gwendolyn who finds herself in a coma, and she is able to hear those talking around her through this coma, so learns the events which led up to her being here, which is that her sister poisoned their entire family at a family gathering, of which she was the only person to survive. So everyone else has died in her family, you know that from the offset, except for her, who is in a coma. And she is basically lying there, unable to do anything else except piece back the history of her family, her and her sister's relationship, and what brought her to this point and what might have caused her sister to commit this horrendous atrocity. And it is so well done because, for one, it's a really engaging, interesting story which focuses mainly on the timeline predating the coma. So we have the coma, we have the events in the lead up to this party at which all of the family members got poisoned, and we also have their like childhood and growing up in Indonesia and going to university abroad and all of those experiences. So 3 sort of timelines at play that piece together, and there's a bit of a mystery going on in the lead up to the party. There's obviously the mystery of why did her sister try and kill everybody, and there's also just the sort of like engaging background story to their relationship and who they are as young women. And I got so enthralled by their story and the mystery in the pre-party timeline that I often forgot what was coming. So obviously you know from the beginning that it's about a woman in a coma and she is reliving this all in her mind, and the build-up is to why did the sister do this. But you're so involved in everything before that, and there's so much else going on, that in the best way possible you often forget that because it becomes almost inconsequential, and then you suddenly get reminded that that's what we're building up to, and it's a lovely little shock to the system. You're like, oh my goodness, yes, there's that as well. It would not be such an engaging read if it was not for the incredible writing at play here. She is just a brilliant writer, and I really can't wait to read more by her because she has a way with words that creates such atmosphere that really draws you in. And like I said, I was so engrossed in the timeline that I was reading whenever I was reading it that I forgot everything else both around me and in the book, because I was just like, goodness, their university experience is so engaging, if that makes sense, and I felt so drawn in, and it was just beautiful but also like a little bit disturbing. There was always just like these little bits of imagery that felt a little bit unnerving and a little bit disturbing, so you never felt like fully relaxed or fully comfortable throughout the reading experience, and that was just the perfect tone for this novel. I'd just like to iterate that it's only 1 o'clock and it literally feels like it's getting darker and darker by the minute. So next up I want to mention probably the oldest book on this collection, because it's a collection of fairy tales and it's the Penguin Book of Scottish Folk and Fairy Tales. So this is part of the traditional Black Penguin Classic series, within which they often release fairy tale collections. So they'll have fairy tale collections from one author or one place, and in this case obviously we have a bunch of fairy tales from one place. These are all fairy and folk tales from Scotland, my home country where I was born, and if you haven't guessed by the accent yet. So we have Scottish fairy tales from various different authors and folklorists like George MacDonald, Tarabi Burns, and a bunch in between. And it is such a lovely encompassing collection of lots of different fairy tales with lots of different tones and lots of different writing styles, some in more broad Scots than others, some in a more recognisable traditional form of English. And I also will add, because I think this is a really nice little feature that wasn't necessarily to benefit me as somebody who's familiar with the Scots language, but would really benefit anyone else reading it, where the original stories do contain more Scots, for example in the Burns poetry, and it may be a little bit more difficult to read, there are little translations which I think is really, really helpful and should just like get you over that last little hurdle of experiencing these original fairy tales. And it is, like I said, just a really great encompassing collection, and it really reminded me how much I adore just sitting down with a bunch of fairy tales. Like I used to love that as a kid and as a teenager, like sitting down with like Italo Calvino's Italian fairy tales or the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales, and just like consuming all of these stories at once. Although, because this is a collection from various different folklorists and authors, there's less repetition than a lot of fairy tale collections. So some fairy tale collections from the same folklorist or the same author I find contain a lot of repetition. I found that there's much more diversity in the storylines of these fairy tales, although they're all as old and magical as any other fairy tale. And it was also a really fun way to read different folklorists and authors from Scottish literature that I hadn't necessarily read before. So it's led me to read more George MacDonald fairy tales than I had before, and also look out for some other folklorists that I made a note of but can't remember off the top of my head, because I'd like to learn more. And as fairy tales go, I'm reasonably familiar with Scottish fairy tales, or a lot of the popular ones, because I grew up on them. We used to get storytellers who came to school and told us these stories. I used to read them in children's collections, but there was quite a few in there that I'd never read before and were just so engaging, some that definitely need to have Disney films made out of them because they were so brilliant. And in another respect, like I mentioned, it really reminded me how much I loved reading fairy tales and made me want to read more collections. So it's something I'm planning on doing in 2021, which is sort of pick up some more collections from different cultures, not just Scotland, and reading more fairy tales. And it also kind of made me want to write some more like Scottish Celtic fairy tale retellings, but like that's a whole other kettle of fish. All in all, it was just such an engaging, fun reading experience that just like warmed my heart, and I really could not fault, and overall loved everything about the collection, and it would probably be now my go-to recommendation for fairy tale collections, especially for those trying to read more Scottish and Celtic fairy tales, so take that for what it is. We then have one that I'm expecting to see on a few people's lists because it's had quite the hype this year, and it did actually come out in 2020, which is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. So this is a Gothic horror novel set in the the mid-20th century, and it very much harkens back to the sort of revived Gothic literature of that area, because obviously the original Gothics are much older, but there's a sort of genre of mid-20th century literature from authors like Shirley Jackson and Daphne du Maurier that this very much recalls, and I very much enjoyed the tone and the themes they recalled from that genre. But it also does more than that, because it deals with themes of colonialism and racism, and all very cleverly, and it follows a young woman in the mid-20th century, in the 1950s, from Mexico, and she is a socialite. She's from a very wealthy background. She lives the life of luxury, but a year previously her cousin, who was like a sister to her growing up, married a man that none of them knew prior to her meeting, and it was quite a fast marriage, and then she moved off to the countryside to this big manor house to live with him and his family, who are from a English background and settled in this area of Mexico generations before. It's been a year since all of that happened, and our protagonist has received some concerning letters from her cousin that imply not everything as well and as happy as it should be in a newlywed's home, and that she is perhaps quite ill, or perhaps her husband isn't treating her right. So the cousin's uncle and our main character's father sends her to sort of investigate, to sort of see what's going on, to see if it's all like as happy dappy as it should be, and to send word if he needs to step in. Now of course there are mysteries galore, because not everything is as it seems in this creepy Gothic English manor house situated in the Mexican countryside. It is dark and it is creepy, and there are secrets and weird dreams and weird sounds and weird stories and creepy old men, and our protagonist is dragged deep down into all of these mysteries. I can't say much more than that, because obviously, like I said, it's a horror novel. The premise is built a lot on shock factor and surprises and mysteries and twists and turns, and I don't want to ruin any of those for you, but I really liked the story. I felt like the atmosphere was so rich. I really haven't read a lot of literature set in Mexico, so it was really nice to read something set in a country that I'm not familiar with, which sort of dealt with the history of the English coming in and profiting off the locals in Mexico. I thought that was really interesting. It gave me like a little flavour of some history that I'd like to read more about, and did what I think horror does best, and what I love about good horror, well, what is good horror to me, is sort of deals with very real, significant themes of, like I mentioned, racism, sexism, colonialism, all the isms, all the horrible isms within this book, but so well. I thought it was really engaging, and for me the ending was kind of exactly how I would have wanted it to end, so I was a happy camper by the end of this one. On the topic of mysteries, my next novel is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. And this book is a lot of fun because it's set in Victorian England and inspired by a bunch of classic novels. So in this book we have Frankenstein meets Sherlock Holmes, meets the island of Dr. Moreau, meets Rappaccini's daughter, meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with additional hints of more to come. So I know that book 2 also features themes and characters from Dracula, but I've not read that book yet, although I'm very excited to. And this was just so well done, because it's not a retelling of any of those stories directly. It instead follows the daughters, either who were part of the original stories or who have been created by the author, of the men from these original horror stories. So for example, our main character is the daughter of Dr. Jekyll. And basically what happens is, after her mother's death, she finds out that her mother has been sending money to somebody by the name of Hyde all of this time. However, it's not who she expected it to be, and it's actually the daughter of Hyde. Enter the second female protagonist. And then from there on we meet all the other daughters from the stories that I mentioned, and they team up and they solve mysteries, and Sherlock Holmes is there and Dr. Watson, and it's just brilliant. And I love that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson never take over the story. It is very much our protagonist and the female characters who are at the centre, who are doing the mystery solving just with a little bit of assistance. This book was enough of homage to those originals, as well as a new thing in itself and an original thing in itself. I.e. it was just a perfect combination, you know, like it sort of harkened back to those stories, some of which I've read, some of which I haven't. So I've read Frankenstein, I've read Sherlock Holmes, but I've never read Rappaccini's Daughter or The Island of Dr. Moreau, for example, but I am familiar with, say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because I've seen film adaptations, and I feel like they're all stories that are sort of part of the public consciousness. But my previous familiarity didn't really matter. Like, I think you could have read none of those and still enjoy this book, or you could have read all of them and enjoy this book because there's so many layers to it. And it's just such fun. I just loved everything about it. I loved the characters, I loved the adventure, I loved the way it strung all these themes and storylines and plots together from these originals, but also commented on them. It isn't just a retelling, it isn't just a character grab stealing ideas from old work. It is commenting on the sexism of a lot of these original works, on the treatment of female characters and also of women in this time, and I think that that is, in the end, what makes it a favourite. This is what makes it such a strong novel and what ties it all together and makes it a little bit different, and loved it. To move away from the dark and mysterious, my last two books are actually both romances, and these both have their own sort of unique selling points, but also both tick the boxes of exactly what I look for in historic romance, so they both had to be on this list. And the first one is The Lady's Deception by Susanna Craig. Now, immediately after finishing this book, which I read in the space of 24 hours, I bought 2 more books by this author. So what more can I say? I obviously loved it. It gave me all of the warm fuzzies, and predominantly because of how respectful the relationship is between the two main characters, and just like how positive and how healthy it is. Now, there are some lies, there are some misunderstandings and some misconceptions and a little bit of lying that leads to their initial meeting, but it's all resolved in the most respectful way, because I think it's perfectly possible to have a compelling storyline and a romance with lots of tension without it being unhealthy, and this book is just perfect. It's exactly what I would want. Everything is dealt with in a sort of adult manner. Like, the people in this book act like adults, can you believe it? And it also had a little bit of humour in there, which I love from my historical romances. In that respect, it very much reminded me of Tessa Dare, who's one of my favourite historical romance writers, but Susanna Craig is probably going to be up there once I've read more of her books as well. So the premise of this novel is that a young Englishwoman's brother is trying to marry her off to a bit of a creepy older lord that she doesn't want to marry because it would be like a good business dealing for him, and the only way she sees to get out of the situation is to find a lawyer and ask for their help in obtaining her inheritance before her birthday, because she's not quite old enough, according to their father's will, to obtain this inheritance. So she treks out, escapes from this castle in rural Ireland to find herself a lawyer, and stumbles across one drunk in the street. And this drunk lawyer also is looking for a governess for his 2 younger sisters, and thinks, hey, this young woman would be the perfect one. This is obviously the governess for me. No idea why she's actually there or what she's actually running from. So we have So there we have our male and female leads, who are of course the romantic interests throughout this book. We then have the absolutely adorable characters of the 2 younger sisters. Like, they add all of the sort of comical levity I need in my historical romances, and I really do need it. I have to say, I prefer the ones with a bit of comedy in them, and I really like that it comes from these 2 young children. I'm pretty sure it was under 200 pages, so like I said, I read it super quickly and just loved it. It was like exactly what I wanted, and if you like historical romance, this is such a good example of that genre. This is exactly what I want from that genre, and this book does exactly what it's set out to do, and it does it well. I thought, however, I would save this one for last because it's another one that I think is quite fun to have made it onto this list, and I read it again for a reading vlog right at the beginning of this year, which may give it away already, because if you've seen it or heard me talk about it, at the beginning of this year I did this vlog called An Actual Scot Reads Highlander Romances, because if you're not familiar, there's this whole subgenre of historical romances which are about sexy Highlander men, which is just so amusing to me as an actual Scot. It is such a strange phenomenon, this real like sort of romanticisation of the Scottish Highlands and the men wearing kilts of the historical Scottish Highlands. So I really wanted to sink my teeth into it and see what I thought of these books, and it was really interesting because some of them I didn't like and some of them I actually loved. One in particular, in fact, which I gave 5 stars, was The Madness of Lord Ian McKenzie by Jennifer Ashley. Now, like Susanna Craig, this is actually an entirely new historical romance writer for me. I'd never read anything by Jennifer Ashley before, but certainly will be. In fact, I'd like to continue on with this series because it follows more brothers from the same family, one of whom is, of course, the male love interest in book 1. So in this instance, we have a combination of both historical romance and also sort of like murder mystery because there are some murders in this book and there is some mystery and there's some police investigations and secret family history, and that is all a really fun addition that makes the book what it is. Like, that's what makes it worth the length it is and gives it a compelling plot to draw you in. But of course at the centre there is this romance and you just become so involved and invested in this romance. And there's so many things I loved about them. In particular, I love that our female protagonist Beth is a widow, because this means we don't go down the route which is all too common in romance of the virginal female character, which is absolutely fine to a degree. Of course there are going to be romances where the female leads are virgins, but most of the time we have female virgins, men who have tons of experience, and the virginity is fetishized to an extent that I find uncomfortable as a reader. And I just think it's nice to find a book that doesn't do that and features a woman who has been in a previous relationship, because it's just not that common, so that makes it a little bit unique in its own right. And then our male love interest is autistic. So the word's never used in the novel because I don't think it was used in the time period in which this book is set. There wasn't an understanding of autism, but the author has confirmed that and talked about that, and it is quite clear throughout the novel that that was her intention. So I just think both of those things are handled really well and really nice to see, because you just don't see them in romance novels particularly often. And I was just so impressed that I ended up really enjoying a Highlander romance and would give it the actual Scott stamp of approval. So yeah, those are my favourite books of 2020. It was difficult to narrow down. There was another 101 books that couldn't make onto this list, but that doesn't mean that a lot of them weren't also excellent, so apologies if you didn't see something else mentioned here. But of course I would love to chat about you with these books. Let me know if you have read any of them, if you're interested in reading any of them, and also please let me know what the best books you read in 2020 were, because this is the time in the year when I often add the most books to my wishlist or the most books to my TBR, because I get so many phenomenal recommendations. But until next time, happy reading, happy new year, and I'll see you all again in the next one. Bye everyone.